The scent of ash and old sorrows clung to the stones of the royal keep. It was a smell Lyris Fawn knew better than her own. The ghost of 1,000 fires burned to warm 1,000 lords who would never know her name. Her life was measured in the scrape of a bucket on flagstones, the whisper of a rag over polished wood, and the relentless ache in her back. She was an omega, a shadow in the king's court, less than the dust motes that danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the high, arched windows. To be seen was to be judged. To be judged was to be broken again. And so she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her wolf, a phantom thing she hadn't felt stir in years, lay dormant and buried deep beneath layers of shame. It was a hollow space in her soul, an ache for a wildness she was born to, but could never claim. The pack thrummed with life around her, a symphony of growls and scents and dominance she could only observe from the muted silence of her own exile. Tonight, the great hall was heavy, with a tension that was more than the usual courtly intrigue. It coiled in the air like a predator, thick with the ozone scent of an impending storm. The elders of the council were present, their faces carved from granite and disapproval, their low voices a menacing drone aimed at the throne. And on that throne, a monolith of scarred power and brooding silence, sat King Thalendros. He was not a king who ruled with gilded words. He ruled with the weight of his presence, a gravity that bent the will of lesser wolves. Scars, pale and silver, mapped a history of violence across one side of his face and disappeared beneath the high collar of his dark tunic. They said he'd earned them fighting back the wild clans of the north, that he'd wrestled a shadow wolf with his bare hands and won. They said he was cursed, that the moon had marked him for a solitary fate. Lyris believed it. His scent filled the hall. Winter pine, cold steel, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical chill. When his silver eyes, chips of a frozen dawn, swept the room, they slid over her as if she were nothing more than a fixture in the wall. It was a mercy she prayed for every single day. Her task was simple, to be unnoticed. To clean the hearth, to gather the discarded goblets, to fade into the tapestry behind her. She kept her head bowed, her world reduced to the scuffed toes of her worn leather shoes and the intricate patterns of the stone floor. But her ears, sharpened by a lifetime of listening for danger, caught fragments of the council's venom. "A bloodline without a future," one elder, Lord Vorlog, hissed, his voice like gravel grinding. "An alpha king with no heir is a beacon for rebellion. The pack's weakened, Thalin. Your strength is not enough to hold the 7 packs alone." Thalin did not move. He simply watched them, his large hands resting on the carved wolves' heads of his throne. The silence that followed was more damning than any roar. It was a void that swallowed their courage, forcing them to look away. It was into that void that the sound came, the soft patter of small feet. A side door opened, and a collective breath was drawn, a subtle shift in the room's energy. The royal governess, a stern woman named Iskara, entered with the child, Prince Olin. He was 4 years old, a miniature of his father, from the fall of his silver hair to the unnerving intensity in his matching eyes. The court softened at the sight of him. He was the pack's hope, the impossible child found abandoned at the keep's gates as an infant, bearing the unmistakable royal mark, a faint crescent-shaped birthmark on his neck. Thalin had claimed him instantly, naming him his heir, silencing any questions with a glare that promised death. The boy was his, and that was law. Lyris's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was the hardest part of her day. To see him so close and to feel nothing, to show nothing. She forced the muscles in her neck to remain slack, her eyes fixed on a dark stain on the floor she needed to scrub away. "He is not yours. He is the king's. You are a ghost. You are nothing." The mantra had been her shield for 4 agonizing years. Olin clutched a small carved wooden wolf. He paid no mind to the assembled lords or the imposing figure on the throne. He was in his own world, as children are. Iskara tried to steer him towards the royal apartments, but he wriggled free, his toy slipping from his grasp. It skittered across the polished stone, spinning and spinning until it came to a rest directly beside Lyris's worn-out shoe. Time stopped. The air in her lungs turned to ice. Every instinct, every fiber of her being, screamed at her to flee, to run and never look back. But her body was frozen, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it felt like death. The governess made a soft, apologetic sound. A guard took a step forward to retrieve the toy, but Olin was faster. He walked toward her, his small boots making soft, determined taps on the floor. The council's murmuring ceased. The king's gaze, which had softened almost imperceptibly at the sight of the boy, now followed him. Lyris could feel the weight of that gaze, a physical pressure on her skin. Don't look up, don't look at him. He is the prince. You are the dirt beneath his feet. He stopped just before her, his head tilted. He wasn't looking at the toy. He was looking at her face, at the face she always kept hidden in shadow and downcast humility. For a dizzying second, she dared to meet his eyes. They were the same silver as the king's, but they held no ice, no storm. They held a deep, ancient recognition, a question. The faint, milky scent of him reached her, a scent she knew from a lifetime ago, from a stolen night of impossible warmth and desperate secrecy. It broke through the walls she had built around her heart. A phantom warmth spread through her barren womb. Her dormant wolf stirred, a flicker of heat in the frozen wasteland of her soul. It was a whisper of a feeling, but it was enough to make her tremble. Olin's small, pale hand lifted, and a single, unadorned finger pointed directly at her. His lips parted. The entire court held its breath, waiting for a childish babble, a demand for his toy. But the word he spoke was not for a toy. It was clear, resonant, and it struck the heart of the great hall like a hammer shattering glass. A single word that destroyed her world. Mother. The sound echoed in the sudden, absolute silence. It hung in the air, shimmering and terrible. Lord Vorlog's jaw went slack. Iskara, the governess, went deathly pale, her hand flying to her mouth. The guard stood as if turned to stone. Every eye in the vast vaulted chamber, lords, ladies, servants, and warriors, swung from the silver-eyed child to the faceless Omega maid, cowering by the hearth. Lyris felt the blood drain from her face. Her carefully constructed world of shadows and silence had just been set ablaze. She was seen, she was exposed. The ghost had been given a face, and it was the face of a traitor. Slowly, deliberately, a sound cut through the shocked paralysis of the room. It was the groan of ancient wood as immense weight shifted upon it. King Thalindros rose from his throne. He was no longer a brooding king listening to his counsel. He was a predator that had scented blood. He stood to his full, terrifying height, his shadow swallowing the dais. And for the first time in 4 years, his silver eyes, burning now with a glacial fire that promised untold ruin, locked onto hers. They did not slide past. They did not dismiss. They pierced through her, pinning her soul to the cold stone. And in their depths, she saw the dawn of a terrifying, inescapable storm. The silence was a living thing, a predator that had sunk its teeth into the great hall and was slowly squeezing the life from it. Lyris's breath was trapped in her lungs, a painful, burning knot. The world had narrowed to the terrifying expanse between her and the throne, to the 2 silver pools of the king's eyes. They were not just looking at her. They were dissecting her, stripping away the years of invisibility until her soul lay bare and shivering on the cold stone. She saw shock in their depths, yes, but beneath it, something far more dangerous, a flicker of incandescent rage, the kind that razes forests and turns mountains to dust. Then the silence shattered. It broke not with a shout, but with a ripple of whispers, insidious and sharp as broken glass. The words spread from lord to lady, from guard to servant. Mother, the Omega, the king's heir. The accusations coiled around her, suffocating and venomous. She could feel their stares like physical blows, 100 judgments piercing her ragged tunic. Humiliation, hot and sickening, washed over her, a familiar tide she had spent her life trying to outrun. Treason, Lord Vorlog's voice boomed, seizing the moment. He stepped forward, his face a mask of righteous fury, though his eyes gleamed with triumphant malice. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger, not at Lyris, but at the king. This is the meaning of your secrecy. You have foisted a half-breed bastard upon this court. An Omega's whelp, passed off as a royal heir, while you leave the true bloodlines to wither. You have sullied the throne, Thalin. The king's gaze did not waver from Lyris. It was as if Vorlog were nothing more than the buzzing of an insect, but a low sound began to build in Thalin's chest, a subterranean growl that vibrated through the floor. The very stones seemed to tremble with it. The torches flickered as if in a sudden wind. The scent of ozone and pure, unadulterated alpha dominance flooded the hall, a physical force that pressed down on everyone, stealing the air, demanding submission. The whispers died instantly. Lord Vorlog paled, taking an involuntary step back. Thalin moved. He descended the dais steps, not with the haste of a man accused, but with the deliberate, lethal grace of a wolf stalking its prey. Each step was silent, measured, and final. He walked past the petrified governess, Iskara, who had finally managed to scoop a now wailing Olin into her arms. The child reached a small hand out, his cries of "Mama" tearing fresh wounds into Lyris's heart. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but her body was locked in place by the king's suffocating aura. He stopped directly in front of her. He was a mountain of shadow and fury, blocking out the light, the court, everything. She was forced to crane her neck to even see the bottom of his jaw, which was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his scarred cheek. His scent enveloped her, that cold, lonely pine and steel, now sharpened with a terrifying edge of rage. It was overwhelming, primal. It bypassed thought and struck deep into the oldest part of her brain, the part that knew predator from prey. Her own scent, she knew, was a wretched thing, the sour stench of terror, the metallic tang of old shame. It was the scent of a cornered, worthless thing. "Guards," the king's voice was unnervingly calm, a low baritone that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. It held no heat, only the absolute cold of a final command. "Take her to the cells." 2 royal guards, their faces impassive but their eyes wide with shock, moved to obey. Their hands clamped down on her arms, their grip hard and impersonal. They hauled her to her feet. The rough wool of their uniforms scraped against her skin. A cry of despair caught in her throat. The cells, the dark, damp places beneath the keep, where criminals and traitors were sent to be forgotten. "My king," Vorlog protested, his courage returning now that the king's attention was off him. "An interrogation is required. A trial. We must know the truth of this filth." Thalin turned his head slowly, and the look he gave the old lord was utterly devoid of warmth. "You question my command in my own hall, Vorlog?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than his growl. "The Omega will be dealt with, by me as for the rest of you." His silver gaze swept across the stunned assembly. "You will remember who is king, and you will hold your tongues, lest I decide to tear them from your heads." The threat was not idle. It hung in the air, heavy and real. No one moved. No one breathed. The guards began to drag her away. She stumbled, her worn shoes slipping on the smooth stone. Her last sight of the great hall was of the king, standing unmoving, a solitary pillar of power, and of her son, Olin, his small face buried in his governess's shoulder, his heartbroken sobs echoing in the cavernous space. Then they were through a heavy wooden door and into the spiraling stone corridors that led down into the belly of the keep. The air grew colder with every step, heavy with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and misery. The sounds of the court faded, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water and the scuttling of unseen things in the darkness. This was her new reality, her cage. She had flown too close to the sun, and her fall was into the deepest dark. The guards did not speak to her. They treated her as if she were a sack of grain, their revulsion a palpable thing. She was no longer just a servant. She was a contamination. They reached the lowest level. A guard with a keyring the size of his fist unlocked a heavy, iron-banded door. He shoved her inside without a word. She fell to her knees on the damp, straw-strewn floor. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang of finality. A heavy bar was dropped into place on the other side. And then silence. A profound, crushing silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. There was no window, only a small barred grate high in the door that let in a sliver of faint torchlight from the corridor. It was enough to see the outlines of her prison, 4 stone walls, a thin, moldy pallet of straw, and a bucket in the corner. It smelled of despair. A sob finally broke free from Lyris's chest, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. She curled into a ball on the filthy floor, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold the shattered pieces of her life together. Olin. her beautiful, impossible boy. For 4 years, she had loved him from a distance, a secret, burning agony in her heart. She had watched him grow, listened for his laughter in the castle halls, and died a little inside every time he was called prince. She had done it to protect him. To be a disgraced Omega's son would have been a death sentence for him, a life of scorn and abuse. But as the king's heir, he was safe. He was honored. He had a future. That future was now in ashes. Her secret was out, and it would not only destroy her, it would destroy him. Her mind reeled back to a night she had tried 1,000 times to forget. A night of a brutal winter storm that had trapped the king in a remote hunting lodge, along with a skeleton staff. She had been sent to tend his fire. He had been different. Not the unapproachable Alpha King, but a man haunted by a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. His eyes had held the same storm that raged outside. He had been drinking, his usual iron control loosened. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen not an Omega servant, but a woman. He had spoken of the emptiness of his throne, the curse of his solitary fate. She, in a moment of impossible bravery, had spoken of the hollowness in her own soul, the silence of her dormant wolf. It hadn't been love. It had been a collision of 2 desperate solitudes, a shared moment of weakness under the howl of the wind, a desperate, fleeting warmth in a world of cold. When she had discovered she was with child, terror had been her only companion. An Omega bearing an Alpha's child was an abomination in the eyes of the pack's rigid laws. She would have been cast out, the child branded a mongrel, so she had hidden it, her body small enough to conceal the life within until the last. And on the night Olin was born, under a sliver of a new moon, she had wrapped him in a royal blanket she had stolen and left him at the keep's gates. The only place she knew he would be safe. She had ripped out her own heart to give him a life she could never provide. And now, a single word had undone it all. A faint flicker of warmth pulsed deep inside her, where her wolf had slept for so long. It was not a roar, not a surge of power, but a fragile ember, rekindled by the sound of her son's voice. It was a painful reminder of everything she had lost, everything she was. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was minutes. Time had no meaning in the dark. The torchlight in the corridor dimmed, and she knew night had fully fallen. She was exhausted, her grief a heavy cloak, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the king's face, the glacial fury in his eyes. Then she heard it. Footsteps, not the clatter of a guard's patrol. This was a single set of footfalls, heavy, silent, and deliberate. Each step held weight, authority. Each one landed closer to her cell. The sound stopped directly outside her door. The faint scent that drifted through the grate was unmistakable. Winter pine and cold steel, the king. The heavy bar on the other side of the door was lifted with a groaning scrape of metal on wood. The key turned in the ancient lock. The sound deafeningly loud in the subterranean quiet. The door swung inward on protesting hinges. King Thalindros filled the entryway, his massive frame a silhouette against the flickering torchlight behind him. He stepped into the cell, his presence sucking all the air from the small space. He had to duck his head to clear the low stone archway. He pulled the door shut behind him, and the darkness that enveloped them was sudden and absolute, broken only by the faint light filtering through the grate. He did not speak. Lyris could hear the soft sound of his breathing, feel the heat radiating from his body. He was a furnace of contained power in the cold, damp cell. She remained huddled on the floor, trembling, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the stones. Finally, his voice came out of the blackness. It was a low rumble, devoid of the rage from the hall, replaced by something colder, sharper, an inquisitor's tone. "You will tell me everything," he commanded. "From the beginning, and you will not lie." A long, tense pause hung between them. She could feel his silver eyes on her, even in the dark. "I will smell it if you do." His voice, a low vibration in the absolute dark, seemed to come from the very stones around them. Lyris flinched, curling tighter into herself. "I will smell it if you do." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as immutable as the moon's pull on the tides. An alpha of his power could scent the subtle chemical shifts of a lie, the spike of fear that accompanied deceit. Honesty was her only path. but the truth was a blade that would sever her from her son forever. Her own voice, when it finally came, was a dry, rasping thing, brittle from years of disuse. "My king," she whispered, the honorific tasting like ash in her mouth. "The night of the blood moon," Valen's voice cut through her hesitation, cold and precise. "4 years ago, the storm at the Northern Lodge. Begin there." He remembered. Of course he remembered. For her, it was the moment her world had fractured. For him, a fleeting detail, a date on a calendar now recalled for an interrogation. The memory rose in her, vivid and painful. The howling of the wind that had rattled the window panes, the scent of wet pine from his hunting leathers, the amber glow of the firelight on the scars that mapped his face. "There was a storm," she began, her voice gaining a fragile strength as the past consumed the terrifying present. "The passes were snowed in. You were not with the court. You were alone." "I was not alone," he corrected, his tone flat. "You were there, tending the hearth." The memory was so clear she could almost feel the heat of the fire on her face again. He had been staring into the flames, a goblet of dark wine in his hand, his kingly aura muted by a profound weariness. His loneliness had been a chasm in the room, and her own had answered it. A fool's empathy. "You spoke of the crown," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light from the grate, not daring to look at the shadow that was him. "Of its weight. You said the throne was a cold stone, and your line would end with it." A long silence stretched between them. She could hear the slow, steady beat of his heart, a powerful, rhythmic drumming in the confines of the cell. It was the only sound besides the drip of water. "I was drunk," he stated, a dismissal. "Yes," she agreed softly. "And I was an omega, invisible." It is easy to speak truths to those who do not matter. The words came out with a bitterness she hadn't intended, a sliver of the resentment she had buried for so long. His scent shifted, the sharp note of anger mellowing into something else, something deeper, more complex. Contemplation. He was following the thread of her scent, testing the memory against the truth of her words. "You spoke of your wolf," she continued, the confession spilling from her now, a river breaking through a dam of fear. "You asked why I was so quiet, why my scent was muted, dimmed." "And you answered," he prompted, his voice a low growl. She swallowed, the memory of her own shame tightening her throat. "I told you my wolf had gone silent after my first heat, that I was barren, an empty vessel, a failure to the pack. It was the ultimate omega disgrace. To be unable to bear children was to be without purpose in the eyes of the elders, to be less than whole. It was the reason she had been relegated to the most menial of tasks, a ghost in her own home. That night," she whispered, the words barely audible, "in that room, for the first time, I felt seen. You saw the person, not the rank, the sorrow, not the failure, and I—" Her voice broke. "I was foolish. I saw a man, not a king, a man as lonely as I was." The darkness in the cell felt alive, thick with unspoken things. He didn't move, but she felt his focus intensify, as if he were trying to see her very soul in the pitch black. "What happened next?" he commanded, his voice rough. The cold was forgotten," she stammered, shame burning her cheeks. "There was only the fire and the storm, and a moment of impossible warmth. A mistake born of loneliness and wine. I never expected to see you again. When I was returned to the keep, I went back to being invisible. I thought it was over." "It was not," he finished for her. "No." A single tear, hot and defiant, traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Weeks later, I knew I was carrying a child. Your child." A sharp intake of breath from the darkness, the first crack in his iron control. The air in the cell grew heavy, charged with a sudden, wild energy. His alpha presence, which had been a controlled pressure, now felt like a physical weight, a storm gathering just before the lightning strikes. "Why?" The word was torn from him, low and guttural. "Why did you hide it? By the moon, woman! Why did you not come to me?" The unfairness of the question struck her, and a spark of defiance flickered through her terror. "Come to you, she asked, her voice shaking with a sudden, desperate anger. "The king, and say what?" That I, a barren, worthless Omega, was carrying your heir? I would have been called a liar and a whore. I would have been executed, and if by some miracle they believed me, what life would he have had? A half-breed, an Omega-born alpha, a stain on your bloodline. Lord Vorlog would have seen him gutted before he ever took a breath. They would have hated him, hunted him. He would have been a weapon for your enemies and a source of shame for your pack. I would not let that be his life. Her chest was heaving, the words she had screamed in the silence of her own mind for 4 years now, echoing off the cold stone walls. She had said it. She had finally said it all. So I left him at the gates, she finished, her anger collapsing back into heart-wrenching sorrow. Wrapped in a royal blanket, with the moon high above, I left him where I knew he would be found, where he would be safe, where the great Alpha King, who had no heir, might see a gift from the gods and claim him, where he could be a prince, not a disgrace. I gave him up so that he could live. I tore out my own heart to give him a crown. The silence that followed was absolute. The dripping water seemed to have stopped. Even his heartbeat was gone. Or perhaps it was simply lost in the roaring of blood in her own ears. She waited for the judgment, for the sentence, for the cold final words that would condemn her. Instead, she heard him move. A rustle of leather, a soft scrape of a boot on stone. He was closer now, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. His scent was overwhelming, pine and steel, but now underneath, a raw, earthy smell of soil after a storm, a scent of confusion and turmoil. A large, calloused hand settled on her shoulder. Lyris flinched violently, a choked cry escaping her lips. The touch was not harsh, not violent, but the sheer shock of it, after years of being untouchable, invisible, was like a brand of fire on her skin. It was heavy, possessive, a claim. It anchored her to the ground, a stark reminder of his immense power and her utter lack of it. His thumb brushed against the coarse fabric of her tunic, a small, almost imperceptible movement over the bone of her collar. Her dormant wolf, that silent ghost within her, stirred again, not with a flicker this time, but with a deep, primal tremor. It was a feeling of being found, of being recognized on a level that had nothing to do with words or sight. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. "The mark," he said, his voice now a rough, quiet thing right beside her ear. "On his neck, the crescent moon, it is the Dross birthmark. It has marked my line for 1,000 years. "I know," she breathed. "I saw it the morning after he was born. I knew then the moon had blessed him, that he was truly yours." His hand tightened on her shoulder, not painfully, but with an undeniable possessiveness. He was connecting the pieces, the impossible truth settling into the foundation of his world, the abandoned infant, the royal mark, the Omega maid who had been at the lodge. "All this time," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "he has been under my roof, and you have watched him." In silence. The agony in that statement was so profound, it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Every day," she confessed. "It has been my penance." He was silent for another long moment, but she could feel the conflict raging within him. The duty of a king, the fury of a man deceived, and the dawning, earth-shattering realization of a father. His wolf was warring with his crown. Then his hand left her shoulder. The loss of his warmth was immediate and absolute, leaving her feeling colder than before. He moved back, creating distance between them again. When he spoke, the king was back. His voice edged with steel, the decision made. "The council is baying for blood. Vorlog wants a public trial. He wants to see you flayed for your lies and me dethroned for my deception." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her confession. A trial, public humiliation, death. "They will use the boy as their weapon," Thalen continued, his voice hard. "They will declare him unfit, a half-breed, and tear the pack apart with a war of succession. I will not allow it." What will you do?" she whispered, her hands trembling. He took a step toward the door. "Vorlog wants a trial. I will give him one, but a trial requires the accused to be present." He paused, his hand on the iron ring of the door. "And by sunrise, you will be gone." Her head snapped up, her eyes trying to penetrate the darkness to see his face. Gone? Exiled? Or executed in secret? The door creaked open, spilling the torchlight from the corridor back into the cell. It illuminated him, casting his scarred face in stark relief. His silver eyes were burning with a cold, determined fire she had never seen before. It was not the rage of a king, but the lethal focus of an alpha protecting his bloodline. "Get up, Omega, Gimne," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are coming with me." Fear was a cold, sharp thing, but the king's command was an undeniable force of nature. It bypassed her terror and moved her limbs for her. Lyris rose from the filthy straw, her body a clumsy automaton of obedience. Her legs were stiff, her muscles screaming in protest, but she stood. The torchlight from the corridor carved him into a figure of myth and shadow, his scarred face a mask of grim purpose. He was the Alpha King, and his will was law, written not in ink, but in blood and instinct. He didn't wait. He turned and strode out into the corridor, expecting her to follow. She stumbled after him, a piece of driftwood caught in the current of a powerful river. He didn't look back to see if she was there. He knew she would be. Her world had been upended, her son's life hung in the balance, and this terrifying, unreadable man was her only guide in the suffocating darkness. They did not go up, back towards the world of the living, of the court and its venomous whispers. Instead, he led her deeper into the foundations of the keep. He took a torch from a sconce, the flame casting their shadows long and dancing on the damp stone walls. He moved with a silent, unnerving familiarity through the labyrinthine passages, a place meant to be known only to the castle guards and the rats. With every step, the scent of the dungeons, of misery and mildew, faded, replaced by the smell of ancient dust and cold, undisturbed earth. He stopped before a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. Running his bare hand over the cold stone, he found a seam she never would have seen. He pressed. With a low groan of grinding rock, a section of the wall receded, revealing a narrow, black maw of a passageway beyond. The air that breathed out from it was stale, tasting of centuries of disuse. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice a low rumble that was absorbed by the oppressive silence. He stepped through, holding the torch high. She hesitated for only a second before plunging into the darkness after him. To be left behind was a fate she couldn't contemplate. The passage was tight, the walls close enough to brush both her shoulders. It sloped steadily upward, the air growing gradually fresher. The only sounds were the soft scrape of their shoes on the gritty floor and the ragged edge of her own breathing. He was a silent shadow ahead of her, his broad back a wall of darkness that blotted out the torchlight. His scent was the only constant, the only thing that felt real in this disorienting tomb, behind steel and that underlying fiercely protective note that had emerged in the cell. It was the scent of an alpha defending his territory, his bloodline. Her mind raced, a frantic torrent of questions. Where was he taking her? To a hidden execution ground? Was this his way of erasing his mistake? Of silencing the Omega who threatened his throne? But his words echoed in her thoughts. "I will not allow it." He wasn't talking about her. He was talking about the threat to Olin. This wasn't about justice or mercy. It was about strategy. She was a piece on a board, a problem to be moved, hidden, or sacrificed. And for Olin's sake, she would be whatever he needed her to be. After what felt like an eternity, the passage ended at a thick, iron-banded wooden door. Thalin set the torch in a rusted sconce on the wall and produced a heavy, archaic key from within his tunic. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. A blast of cold, clean night air hit her, and Lyris gasped. It was intoxicatingly fresh after the stale air of the tunnels. They had emerged into a small, abandoned stable yard, tucked away behind the castle's outer wall. A single, massive black destrier, already saddled, stood waiting, its breath pluming in the frigid air. The horse was a magnificent beast, all muscle and barely contained power, much like its master. The moon, nearly full, hung like a silver coin in the ink-black sky, bathing the yard in an ethereal glow. It illuminated the king as he turned to face her. His silver eyes seemed to gather the moonlight, glowing with a faint, predatory light. "We ride now," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy, powerful grace. The warhorse shifted under his weight but did not protest. He looked down at her, his large hand extended. "Come." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ride with him? The thought was terrifying. The intimacy of it, the proximity, was a violation of the rigid order that had governed her entire life. Omegas did not touch alphas, servants did not touch kings, but she had no choice. Placing her trembling hand in his felt like touching a flame. His grip was firm, his skin calloused and warm. With a single, effortless pull, he lifted her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle as if she weighed nothing. She landed against his chest with a soft jolt. Her back was pressed against the hard planes of his torso, his arm a band of iron that came around to grip the reins, effectively caging her in. The heat of his body soaked through the thin fabric of her tunic, a shocking, overwhelming warmth that seemed to sear her skin. His scent was everywhere, a thick, potent cloud of pine and cold metal that filled her lungs, making her dizzy. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her spine. He spurred the horse, and they surged forward, out of the hidden yard and into the deep, dark woods that bordered the castle. The wind whipped her hair back, cold and sharp against her face, but she was cocooned in the impossible heat of his body. The rhythmic thunder of the horse's hooves on the frozen earth was a drumbeat counting down the moments of her old life, leaving it further and further behind. She kept her body rigid, trying to lean forward, to create even a fraction of an inch of space between them, but it was useless. With every stride of the powerful horse, she was pressed back against him. It was a torment. The phantom stirring of her wolf, which had been a faint tremor in the cell, was now a low humming vibration deep within her, awakened by the overwhelming proximity of his pure alpha power. It was a confused, primal response, part terror and part something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she couldn't name it, a feeling of being shielded, protected. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the royal forest, a place she had only ever seen from the highest windows of the keep. The trees grew thick, their branches forming a dense canopy that blotted out the stars, leaving only the moon to light their path. Finally, he slowed the horse, guiding it into a small, hidden clearing. In the center stood a small, rustic cabin built of dark, heavy logs. It was a forester's lodge or an old hunting shelter, long abandoned by the look of it. It was utterly isolated, a secret kept by the ancient woods. He dismounted in one fluid motion and then reached up for her. His hands went to her waist, spanning it easily, and lifted her down. Her feet touched the ground, but her legs felt unsteady. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, his silver eyes searching her face in the moonlight, as if seeing it for the first time. Then he released her and turned to tend to the horse. Lyris wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold air, the absence of his heat a sudden, shocking loss. She watched as he unsaddled the destrier and set it loose to graze in a small, fenced-off paddock behind the cabin. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived beyond the confines of a throne room. He led her inside. The cabin was a single room, sparse and masculine. There was a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner piled with thick furs. It was clean but smelled of cold stone and wood smoke. Without a word, he knelt at the hearth and with a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life. The kindling caught, and soon a cheerful fire was crackling, pushing back the oppressive cold and shadows. The warm golden light softened the hard lines of his face, making the scars there seem less like marks of violence and more like the lines of a map charting a difficult journey. He rose and turned to her. "Vorlog and the council believe you are in the dungeons," he said, his voice low and calm. "They will demand a trial at sunrise. When the guards go to fetch you, they will find the cell empty, the lock broken from the inside, a loose stone in the wall pushed out into an old sewer tunnel. They will assume you fled like the liar and coward Vorlog will claim you are." Lyris stared at him, understanding dawning. "You are creating a story." "I am controlling the narrative," he corrected. "Without you, his accusations are baseless. He has no proof. Only the word of a 4-year-old boy, which can be dismissed as a child's fancy. I will quell the dissent, solidify my position, and Olin's legitimacy will be secured." It was a brilliant, ruthless plan, and it hinged entirely on her complete and utter disappearance from the world. She would be a ghost once more, but this time, her prison would be a lonely cabin instead of a stone cell. "And what of me?" she whispered. Do I stay here forever? He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You will stay here. You will be safe. You will be provided for. A woodsman I trust will bring supplies and news once a week. No one else will ever know you are here. He took a step closer, the firelight dancing in his silver eyes. I am not doing this for you, Omega. I am doing this for my son. My heir. The words should have stung, but they didn't. They were the truth, the same truth that had guided her own actions for 4 years. They were protecting Olin. It was the only thing they had in common. I understand, she said, her voice steady. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze intense, analytical. Do you? He asked softly. He moved closer still, closing the space between them, until he was standing directly before her. He was not touching her, but his presence was a physical force. His heat and his scent, a dizzying vortex. Your scent, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. In the cell, it was all fear, faded, but now, something has changed. He tilted his head, his gaze piercing. The fear is still there, but underneath it, your wolf is stirring. I can smell it, faint, but it is there. Lyrus's breath caught. He could sense that? The fragile, flickering ember she had thought was hers alone? He lifted a hand, and she flinched, but he didn't touch her. He simply let it hover in the air near her throat. You sacrificed everything for him. You lived as less than nothing to keep him safe. You endured the silence of your own wolf. You are more than just the vessel of his birth. His eyes held hers, and in their silver depths, she saw a flicker of something beyond the king, beyond the alpha. A grudging respect, an acknowledgement of her sacrifice. Vorlog was right about one thing, Thalin murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that resonated deep in her bones. The air bears the mother's scent. For 4 years it has been faint on him, a mystery I could not place, a ghost of a scent. But tonight, when he called to you, the bond between you flared to life. He finally let his gaze drop from her eyes to her throat, as if he could see the mark of their connection there. You bear my son's scent now, Lyrus, he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it from his lips was a shock, a claiming. It clings to you like a second skin. It marks you as his. He paused, his silver eyes rising to lock with hers again, pinning her in place with their sheer intensity. And through him, he finished, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper that sealed her fate more surely than any prison bars. You now bear mine. The words hung in the air between them, more solid and binding than any iron chain. You now bear mine. It was a pronouncement, a branding. Lyrus felt it in the deepest part of her being, a resonance that shook the foundations of her soul. Her dormant wolf, that forgotten ghost, uncurled from its slumber, not with a stir this time, but with a deep, shuddering sigh of recognition. It was as if it had been waiting in a long, cold winter for the scent of its alpha, and now that it had come, the thaw was agonizing and absolute. She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her own throat as if she could ward off the invisible mark. Her own scent, which had always been a faint, apologetic whisper of rain and chamomile, now felt fundamentally altered. Woven through it, impossible to separate, was the powerful, territorial scent of winter pine and cold steel. It was an invasion, a violation of the last piece of herself she had truly owned. No, she breathed, the denial a fragile thing against the overwhelming reality. Thalin's silver eyes watched her, unblinking. There was no triumph in them, no satisfaction, only a grim acknowledgement of a primal truth that had just asserted itself over politics and secrets. The bond is there, he stated, his voice a low, gravelly tone. It is faint, born of blood and not of the bite, but it is there. A wolf would know it. Vorlog will not see it, but his wolf will sense it. It is why you must remain hidden. For anyone to scent you now would be a declaration of war. It was a cage within a cage, hidden from the world to protect her son, and now marked in a way that made her a walking, breathing provocation to the king's enemies. He turned from her then, his brief moment of connection severed. The king was back in control, his focus on the brutal necessities of the coming dawn. There is dried meat, grain, and water in the cellar. The woodsman, Fendrel, will come in 3 days' time. Do not leave the cabin. Do not light a fire during the day. Do not make a sound. You are a ghost now. You do not exist." He strode to the door, his movements economical and decisive. He was a force of nature, a storm that had swept through her life and was now receding, leaving wreckage and a changed landscape in its wake. He paused with his hand on the latch, his back still to her. "The furs on the bed," he said, his voice rough. "They are mine. Your scent will cling to them. It will help to mask you from any wild thing that wanders too close." It was a practical instruction, but it landed like a physical blow. He wanted her to steep herself in his scent, to wrap herself in it, to make his claim on her absolute even in his absence. It was a strategic move to ensure her survival, but it felt like the most intimate command he could possibly give. Then he was gone. The door opened, letting in a swirl of frigid air, and then closed with a soft final thud. The sound of his horse's hooves, powerful and swift, faded into the silence of the forest. Lyris was left alone in the small firelit cabin, the echo of his presence so strong it felt as if he were still standing there. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her bones. She stumbled to the bed, her legs giving way. She didn't lie on it, but sank to the floor beside it, her hands gripping the edge of the rough wooden frame. The furs he had spoken of were a dark, heavy pile, bear and wolf pelts, thick and luxurious. Tentatively, she reached out and touched one. The scent that rose from it was pure, undiluted thalin. It was him, without the anger, without the tension. It was the scent of his own private refuge, the smell of his true, solitary nature. It was overwhelming. Her wolf, awakened and raw, yearned for it. The instinct was so powerful, so primal, it terrified her. It was a craving to burrow into that scent, to find solace in the heart of the predator's den. Her human side, the part that had endured years of shame and fear, recoiled in horror. To surrender to that instinct would be to lose the last of herself. The next 3 days were a waking dream, a slow descent into a new reality. She moved through the small cabin like a specter, her world reduced to 4 log walls and a stone hearth. During the day, she obeyed his command, sitting in the cold gloom, eating the tough, salty, dried meat, and watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of light that penetrated the shuttered window. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of her own heart. At night, she allowed herself the fire. She would sit before it for hours, the warmth a small comfort against the profound chill of her isolation. It was in those long, dark hours that she began to feel the change most acutely. Her senses, long dulled by the muted life of a servant, were sharpening. She could smell the coming snow on the wind, a clean metallic tang. She could hear the faint, high-pitched squeak of a shrew hunting under the snow outside. The world, which had been a gray, muffled place, was slowly coming into focus with terrifying clarity. It was her wolf, reawakening, and always there was the scent. His scent on the furs, a constant low thrum in the air of the cabin, and her scent on herself, a confusing, hybridized thing she could no longer recognize as her own. She would catch a trace of it on her wrist and feel a jolt, a disorienting sense of being both herself and not herself. She was marked, claimed. On the 3rd day, as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the snow-laden forest in hues of orange and purple, she heard it, the crunch of boots on snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to douse the fire, to become one with the shadows. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her breathing shallow, her newly honed senses straining. The footsteps were heavy, steady. They stopped outside the door, a moment of tense silence, and then a soft, respectful knock. "The king sends me," a low, gruff voice said. It held no threat. Lyris's breath escaped her in a shaky exhale. Fendrel, the woodsman, slowly her trembling hands unlatched the door and pulled it open just a crack. The man standing there was built like an old oak, broad and weathered. A thick, gray-streaked beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, when they met hers, were kind but wary. He held a large burlap sack in one hand and a freshly dressed rabbit in the other. He averted his gaze quickly, fixing it on the doorframe beside her head. He had clearly been given his orders. I have supplies, he said, his voice the rumble of shifting rocks. And word from the keep. She opened the door wider, and he stepped inside, bringing the cold and the scent of the forest with him. He set the sack on the floor and hung the rabbit from a hook near the hearth. He kept a respectful distance, his deference so profound it was almost uncomfortable. He was not looking at an omega. He was looking at the king's something, a secret he knew better than to question. The king? She asked, her voice a croak. He is well, Fendrel answered, his eyes still fixed on the wall. He played his part. Raged in the throne room about the treacherous Omega's escape. Lord Vorlog demanded the castle be torn apart to find you. The king allowed it, knowing they would find nothing. Vorlog looks a fool. His accusations have lost their teeth for now. The council is unsettled, but they fear the king's wrath more than they trust Vorlog's ambition. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. The plan had worked. Fallon had been right. Olin was safe. And the prince? She whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. Olin? At this, the woodsman's guarded expression softened. A flicker of pity entered his eyes, and he finally met her gaze. The boy is quiet. He does not laugh. The governess says he asked for you. The words struck her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She staggered back, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Olin, her sweet boy, he was looking for her. He was hurting. The careful, cold logic of her sacrifice, of her imprisonment, shattered into a million pieces of pure maternal agony. What good was a crown if the child who wore it was broken-hearted? He calls for his mother, Fendrel added, his voice gentle now, laced with a sorrow that was not his own. The king stays with him every night until he falls asleep. He holds the little wooden wolf you must have carved for him. He will not let it go. A raw, keening sound tore itself from her throat. The wooden wolf. A simple, clumsy thing she had whittled from a piece of firewood in stolen moments, leaving it where she knew he would find it. A secret gift, a mother's touch across an impassable divide. And he knew he had kept it. The woodsman, seeing her distress, bowed his head awkwardly. I have said too much. The king's orders were only to bring supplies and tell you that the plan holds. He backed toward the door. I will return in a week's time. He slipped out as quietly as he had arrived, leaving her alone once more. But the cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a cage, and its bars had been forged from her son's own sorrow. She sank to her knees before the fire, the tears she had held back for 4 years finally falling, hot and silent. The king's plan had saved Olin's title, his future, but it was starving his heart. And she was the one locked away with the key. Her gaze fell upon the wolf pelts piled on the bed, his scent, the bond, a mark of possession she had railed against. But now a new, desperate thought bloomed in the darkness of her despair. A bond was a connection, a tie that stretched across distance. If he could smell her wolf stirring, if the bond was real, then perhaps it worked both ways. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pulled one of the heavy furs into her lap. She buried her face in it, inhaling the deep, primal scent of the Alpha King, the father of her child. She did not fight the instinct this time. She surrendered to it, letting the scent fill her, letting her reawakened wolf answer its call. She focused all her will, all her love, all her desperate, aching sorrow for her son, and pushed it down that fragile, shimmering thread of connection. A silent scream from one heart to another. A mother's desperate prayer sent out into the cold, lonely night. I am here, my son. I am here. The king's solar was a cage of shadows and silence. Maps of the 7 territories lay sprawled across a massive oak table, their borders drawn in faded ink, their mountain ranges rendered in stark, unforgiving charcoal. Thalen stood before the hearth, one hand braced against the cold stone of the mantelpiece, the other clenched into a fist at his side. The fire was dying, its embers glowing like the resentful eyes of cornered animals. Outside, a bitter wind howled around the turrets of the keep, a mournful sound that echoed the hollow ache in his chest. His plan had worked. On the surface, it was a masterstroke of political theater. He had feigned a rage that felt frighteningly real, his roars of fury at the Omega's escape shaking the very foundations of the Great Hall. He had allowed Vorlog to lead a frantic, toothless search of the castle, a public display of futility that had painted the old lord as a paranoid fool, grasping at shadows. The council was cowed, the whispers silenced by the sheer, terrifying force of his will. Olin's position was, for the moment, secure. The crown was safe, but the victory tasted like ash. Every night he sat by his son's bed, a place the governess had once occupied. He watched the boy's small chest rise and fall, listened to the soft, troubled breaths of his sleep. And every night the same word fell from Olin's lips in a heartbroken murmur. Mother. It was a dagger that twisted in Thalin's gut, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the cost of his crown. He had secured his heir's future by stealing his past, by erasing the one person his son's young heart had instinctively claimed. He saw her face in the dying flames. Lyris, the Omega Maid, a ghost he had barely noticed for 4 years, and who now haunted his every waking moment. He had believed her a liar, a traitorous whore who had somehow managed to fool the entire court. His initial fury had been a cold, killing rage, but in the darkness of that cell, her story had unfolded, each word laced with the undeniable scent of truth, of sacrifice, of a pain so profound it had dwarfed his own loneliness. She had torn out her own heart to give their son a throne, and he, in turn, had locked her away to protect it. They were two sides of the same brutal coin. A tremor, faint and unexpected, ran through him. It was not physical, but something deeper, a disturbance in the core of his being. He straightened, his head tilting, his senses reaching. It was the bond, the faint ghostly thread that now connected him to her. It was humming, vibrating with the frequency of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was her sorrow, her despair. A wave of emotion so powerful it traveled across the miles of frozen forest to crash against the shores of his soul. He felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of loss, a mirror of her own grief. It was an echo of her love for their son, a raw maternal agony that was both alien and deeply familiar. His own wolf, a beast of iron control and solitary instinct, paced restlessly within him. It recognized the scent of its mate's distress. The words surfaced in his mind, unbidden and shocking. Mate. No, she was an Omega. He was the king. Theirs was not a bond of choice or ceremony, but an accidental, inconvenient tether of blood and biology. Yet the instinct was undeniable. His wolf wanted to answer her call, to race through the night and stand between her and her sorrow. He slammed his fist against the stone mantle. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arm, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil. He was a king. His duty was to the pack, to the stability of the 7 territories, not to the emotional whims of a hidden Omega or the primal urges of his own wolf. He had made his choice. He would endure the echo of her pain, just as he endured the weight of his crown. A soft knock came at the door. "Enter," he growled, turning from the fire, his face once more an impenetrable mask of command. Lord Marin, his oldest advisor and the only member of the council he truly trusted, entered the solar. Marin was a wolf in winter, his hair the color of frost, his face lined with the wisdom of 100 seasons, but his eyes were still sharp and discerning. "Thalin," Marin said, his voice a calm baritone. He bowed his head slightly. "The patrols have returned from the southern border. The Shadowmane pack grows restless. They scent weakness in our court, an heir whose blood is questioned." Thalin's jaw tightened. "Vorlog's whispers have long claws." "They do," Marin agreed, stepping closer to the map table. "And they have found something to sink them into. A rumor. A trader from the north speaks of a hunting lodge, a winter storm 4 years ago, and a quiet Omega maid who was sent back to the keep in unusual haste." The air in the room grew cold. Thalin felt the blood drain from his face, a chill that had nothing to do with the dying fire. Vorlog was not a fool. His public accusations had failed, so now he was digging, unearthing the roots of the secret Thalin had tried to bury. "It is nothing," Thalin said, his voice flat and hard. "The ramblings of a drunkard seeking coin." Marin met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Perhaps, but Vorlog is weaving it into a tapestry of deceit. He is suggesting the Omega did not flee, but was silenced, that you hid her to hide your own sin. He is painting you not as a cuckold, but as a tyrant who would pass off a half-breed as a pure-blood heir. The accusation was far more dangerous. To be deceived was a weakness. To be the deceiver was a betrayal of the pack's most sacred laws. "He has no proof," Thalen snarled. "He does not need proof," Marin countered calmly. "He only needs to plant the seed of doubt. The packs are sworn to the Dross bloodline. If they believe that blood is tainted, their loyalty will shatter. The Shadowmanes will be the first to break the pact. The others will follow. It will be war, Thalen. A war that will tear our people apart." The weight on Thalen's shoulders felt immense, the fate of thousands resting on a secret whispered in a snowbound lodge. He had locked Lyris away to protect Olin from scorn, but in doing so he had created a power vacuum, a mystery that his enemies were now filling with their own poison. His strategy of control was failing. He looked at the map, at the sprawling territories held together by oaths and the strength of his name. A name Vorlog was now trying to turn to mud. There was only one way to silence the rumors, one way to reassert his authority beyond any shadow of a doubt: the truth, but a truth delivered on his terms. "There is another ritual," Marin said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "An old one, seldom used. The rite of scent, a way to prove a blood claim before the entire pack, under the light of the full moon." Thalen knew the rite. The heir is presented, and the Alpha Father anoints the child's brow. The pack elders then approach one by one. If the child's scent rings true, carrying the unmistakable echo of the Alpha's bloodline, the claim is validated by the spirits of their ancestors and the pack itself. It was ancient, powerful magic. "It is dangerous," Thalen said, his voice low. "If there is any discrepancy in the scent, if the ancestors do not accept the claim, the child is declared an outcast, unclaimed. His life is forfeit." "It is the only way," Marin insisted. "A public declaration of blood right witnessed by all 7 packs. It will silence Vorlog forever and bind the territories to Olin so fiercely that no rumor could ever break the bond." Thalen stared into the embers, his mind racing. Lyris, the bond. Her scent was now woven with his through Olin. Would the elders smell it? Would they smell the Omega in the Alpha's air and declare him tainted? Or would the power of his own Alpha blood be enough to overwhelm it, to prove the Dross lineage was dominant? It was a gamble of terrifying proportions. Olin's life on the line. And yet, what choice did he have? To do nothing was to let Vorlog's poison spread, to allow the kingdom to crumble into civil war. To act was to risk everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. He thought of Olin's sad, quiet face, of the wooden wolf clutched in his hand. He thought of Lyris, alone in the forest, her heart breaking for the son she could not hold. He had tried to protect them by separating them, by hiding the truth. But the truth, it seemed, had a power of its own. It was not a thing to be caged. "The next full moon is in 2 nights, Marin said, his voice a quiet statement of fact. "The packs can be summoned." Thalen turned from the fire, his decision made. The path of the king was not the path of the heart. It was the path of sacrifice. He had sacrificed his own happiness for the crown long ago. Lyris had sacrificed her freedom for her son. Now he would be forced to sacrifice his son's safety for the sake of the kingdom. "Send the summons," he commanded, his voice devoid of all emotion, a cold, hard instrument of his will. "Tell them the king will prove his heir. Tell them to prepare for the rite of scent." Marin bowed his head, a look of grim relief on his face. "It will be done, my king." He turned and left the solar, leaving Thalen alone once more with the shadows and the weight of his impossible choice. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark, sprawling forest. Somewhere out there, she was sending her sorrow down the bond that tied them together. He wondered if she could feel the cold terror that was now gripping him. He was about to wager their son's life on the strength of a bloodline she had been told she would only dilute. The irony was as bitter as the winter wind. The moon rose, full and luminous, a great silver eye in the black velvet of the sky. It poured its cold, sacred light down upon the ancient gathering stone, a massive, flat-topped granite monolith that stood in the center of a clearing miles from the keep. For generations, it had been a place of judgment, of ritual, and of law. Tonight, it was to be a place of reckoning. Lyris watched from the deep shadows of the tree line, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Fendrel had brought the news, his face grim, his words clipped. The rite of scent. Olin, a public trial for a 4-year-old boy. The woodsman had looked away as he spoke, unable to meet her eyes, as if the king's command were a personal betrayal. He said you were to remain here, Fendrel had reported dutifully. He said it was an order. But Lyris had stopped being an obedient Omega the moment she heard her son's life was at stake. As soon as Fendrel had vanished back into the woods, she had pulled on a dark cloak he'd left behind and fled the cabin, a ghost slipping through the moon-drenched trees. She ran, heedless of the branches that tore at her cloak or the icy roots that threatened to trip her. Her reawakened wolf drove her, lending a desperate speed and endurance to her limbs. It was not a choice. It was a compulsion. A mother could not hide in a cage while her pup faced the judgment of the pack. Now, shivering in the cold, she peered out at the scene. Torches burned in a wide circle around the stone, their flickering orange light a stark contrast to the moon's serene silver. Hundreds of wolves were assembled, a living sea of dark fur and tense muscle. She could smell them, the earthy scent of the valley packs, the sharp, frosty scent of the mountain clans, and the smoky, aggressive tang of the Shadowmanes from the southern border. Their collective presence was a low, humming vibration that shook the very air, a symphony of barely leashed power. In the center of the clearing, near the stone, stood the elders of the 7 packs. Lord Vorlog was prominent among them, his face a mask of smug anticipation. He believed this was his victory, the moment the half-breed would be exposed and the king's reign would crumble. Then a path cleared through the assembled wolves. Silence fell, absolute and reverent. King Thalendros walked into the torchlight. He was not dressed in the finery of the court, but in simple dark leathers, the attire of a warrior. He moved with a lethal grace, his scarred face grim, his silver eyes sweeping over the assembly with an authority that bent them to his will. In his arms he carried Olin. A choked sob caught in Lyris's throat. Her son. He was so small in the king's powerful embrace. He wore a simple white tunic, and his silver hair shone like spun moonlight. He wasn't crying, but his small face was pale, his eyes wide as he looked at the sea of grim-faced wolves surrounding him. He clutched his small wooden wolf to his chest, as if it were a shield. Thalin stopped before the gathering stone and gently set Olin down upon its flat surface. The boy stood there, a tiny, solitary figure in the vast, silent arena. Thalin knelt before him, placing his large hands on Olin's small shoulders. He leaned in and whispered something Lyris couldn't hear, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. Olin nodded, his lower lip trembling slightly. Thalin rose to his full, imposing height and turned to face the elders. "You have questioned the blood of my heir!" His voice boomed, carrying across the clearing with the force of a thunderclap. It was the voice of a king, an alpha, a father pushed to the edge. "You have allowed whispers and rumor to poison the unity of our packs. Tonight, we end the whispers. Tonight, the moon and the spirits of our ancestors will be the judge." He drew a small silver knife from his belt. The moonlight glinted on the blade. With a swift, deliberate motion, he sliced his own palm. Dark blood welled, gleaming like liquid rubies in the torchlight. He did not flinch. He extended his hand over Olin's head, allowing a single drop of his blood to fall and anoint the boy's forehead. "Blood of my blood," he declared, his voice ringing with ancient power. "Flesh of my flesh, I claim you, Thalin's son, of the line of Dross." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The air crackled with energy, with old magic. The scent of the king's blood, potent and fiercely alpha, washed over the clearing. Olin stood perfectly still, the crimson mark stark against his pale skin. Lord Vorlog was the first to step forward, his role as the chief accuser giving him the right. His face was a mask of predatory eagerness. He approached the stone, his wolf pressing close to the surface of his skin, his nostrils flaring as he drew in Olin's scent, seeking the truth. He leaned close to the boy, inhaling deeply. Lyris held her breath, her blood turning to ice in her veins. This was the moment. Would Vorlog smell the Omega in him? The taint he was so certain was there? Vorlog straightened, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He sniffed again, his brow furrowed. There was no triumphant roar of discovery. There was only puzzlement. He could clearly smell Thalin's bloodline, powerful and undeniable, singing in the boy's scent. It was the dominant note, the core of his being, but there was something else. an undertone he couldn't quite place, a hint of wild rain and chamomile, but it was interwoven so tightly with the king's scent of pine and steel that it was impossible to separate. It did not smell of a different bloodline. It smelled like a hidden facet of the king's own. Frustrated and confused, Vorlog could not voice the accusation he had planned. He could not deny the overwhelming evidence of the dross blood. With a tight, angry jerk of his head, he gave a curt nod of acceptance and stepped back into the circle of elders. One by one, the other elders approached the stone. Each leaned in, each inhaled the boy's scent, and each showed the same flicker of confusion, followed by an undeniable acceptance. The king's blood was too strong. The claim was true. Lyris felt a wave of dizzying relief. He had done it. Thalin's sheer power, his pure alpha blood, had been enough to overwhelm her own lesser lineage in their son's scent. Olin was safe, but the rite was not over. The final judge was the alpha of the Shadowmanes, a brutal, hulking wolf named Kaelin, whose loyalty had always been the most tenuous. He was a creature of pure instinct, less concerned with politics than with primal strength. He stalked towards the stone, his eyes, burning gold in the torchlight, fixed on Olin. He did not lean in with courtesy. He lowered his massive head and inhaled the boy's scent with a deep, guttural growl, his senses seeking any sign of weakness, any flaw. And then, it happened. As Kaelin drew his deep breath, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, swirling from the dark forest where Lyris hid. It carried her scent with it, the scent of her fear, her desperation, and her overwhelming, all-consuming love for her child. A scent that was no longer just hers, but was now irrevocably marked by the king. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the mysterious undertone in Olin's own scent, now presented in its raw, pure form. Kaelin's head snapped up. His golden eyes widened, and he looked from the boy on the stone directly towards the tree line, directly at the spot where Lyris was hiding. He had smelled it. He had smelled her. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest. "Treachery," he snarled, his gaze locking with Thalin's. "The mother, the Omega ghost. She is here. Her scent is on the wind. The boy reeks of her. He is tainted." Panic erupted. The assembled wolves surged forward, a wave of snarls and confusion. Vorlog's face lit with vicious triumph. "Seize her," he roared. "She is in the trees." Thalin moved faster than thought. In a blur of motion, he snatched Olin from the stone, pulling the boy into his protective embrace. He drew his knife, his body a shield before his son. His silver eyes, now blazing with a terrifying glacial fury, met Lyris's across the clearing. There was no anger there for her disobedience, only a silent, desperate command. "Run." But she was frozen. Wolves from the Shadowmane pack were already crashing into the woods, their forms shifting, melting into their massive four-legged shapes. Their growls were the sound of tearing earth. They were hunting her. Suddenly, a massive shape erupted from the tree line beside her. Fendrel. The old woodsman had shifted, his wolf form a grizzled gray beast of surprising size and ferocity. He threw himself at the first of the Shadowmane wolves, a blur of teeth and claws, buying her a precious second. "Go!" he roared, his voice a guttural mix of man and beast. The primal instinct to flee finally broke through her terror. Lyris turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. Branches whipped at her face, and the sounds of the enraged pack were close behind her, a nightmare of snapping jaws and thundering paws. She was no match for them. Her human legs were too slow, too weak. A massive, black-furred wolf burst through the undergrowth in front of her, cutting off her path. It was Kaelin. He crouched low, his golden eyes burning with hate, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Saliva dripped from his bared teeth. It was over. She closed her eyes, bracing for the killing lunge, a silent prayer for her son on her lips. A roar shattered the night. It was not the growl of a wolf, but the sound of a mountain breaking apart, a sound of absolute, untempered rage and power. Thalin. He exploded into the trees, no longer a king, no longer a man. He was a force of nature, his own wolf unleashed. His form was immense, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his fur the color of shadow and silver, his eyes glowing with the pure, cold light of the moon. He was not just an alpha. He was a legend come to life. He slammed into Kaelin with the force of an avalanche, the impact throwing the Shadowmane alpha back 10 feet. the two massive forms became a whirlwind of black and silver fur, of teeth and claws, a maelstrom of primal fury. Lyris could only stare, her terror replaced by a profound, heart-stopping awe. She had never seen Thalin's wolf. No one had for years. It was a thing, a myth. And it was fighting for her. The other Shadowmane wolves, seeing their alpha engaged, hesitated. Their hunt for her was forgotten, their attention locked on the epic battle between the two kings. Thalin was a dervish of controlled violence. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold. He was not just fighting Kaelin, he was punishing him. He tore a gash in the Shadowmane's flank, dodged a retaliatory snap, and sank his teeth into the thick muscle of Kaelin's shoulder, shaking his head with a savage growl that ripped a cry of pain from his opponent. Kaelin, bleeding and outmatched, broke away, his ears flat against his skull in a posture of submission. Thalin did not pursue. He stood over the defeated alpha, his massive chest heaving, his silver eyes burning with a possessive fire that swept over Kaelin, over the other wolves, and finally came to rest on her. He had not just defeated a rival, he had made a statement. He stepped forward, his huge form radiating an aura of absolute dominance that forced every wolf in the clearing, friend and foe alike, to lower their heads in submission. He walked past the cowering Kaelin, past the stunned elders, and came to a stop directly in front of Lyris. He was still in his wolf form, a magnificent, terrifying creature of shadow and moonlight. He lowered his massive head, his silver eyes locking with hers. He was not looking at a disgraced Omega. He was looking at something he had just fought and bled to protect. Then he did something that shattered the last vestiges of the old world. He leaned forward and gently, possessively, nudged her side with his massive head, marking her with his scent, with his blood. And as the entire pack watched in stunned silence, a low, rumbling growl of pure, undeniable ownership rose from his chest, a sound that echoed through the forest and sealed their fate forever. It was not a word, but every wolf there understood its meaning perfectly. Mine. The word echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the forest clearing. Mine. It was not a plea, nor a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, a seismic shift in the world's foundation, spoken in the ancient guttural language of the wolf. Every head was bowed. Every wolf, from the lowest-ranking pack member to the highest elder, was held captive by the sheer, suffocating weight of Thalin's dominance. He stood before Lyris, a creature of myth and moonlight, his massive silver and shadow form, a living bulwark between her and the world that had tried to tear her apart. Slowly, with a control that was more terrifying than his rage, the great wolf began to recede. Bones shifted, muscles contracted, and the primal form melted away, leaving the man in its place. Thalin stood before them all, naked from the waist up, his scarred torso gleaming with sweat in the torchlight. Blood from a dozen minor cuts dripped from his arms, but he seemed not to notice. His silver eyes, burning with the last embers of his wolf's fire, were fixed only on her. He held out his hand. It was the same hand he had offered in the stable yard, the hand that had pulled her from the shadows into his world. This time she did not hesitate. Her own hand, small and trembling, fit inside his. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, possessive grip that was both a comfort and a claim. He drew her forward, out of the shadows of the trees and into the ring of torchlight, placing her at his side before the entire assembly. He did not hide her. He presented her. Lord Vorlog, his face the color of spoiled milk, finally found his voice. "Madness!" he spat, his body trembling with impotent rage. "You would defy the sacred laws? And Omega you cannot." "I can," Thalin's voice cut through the old lord's tirade, as cold and sharp as the edge of a winter ass. "And I have. The law is what I say it is. The moon has borne witness. My wolf has made its claim." He turned his glacial gaze upon Vorlog, and the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You who would have used my son's life as a stepping stone to power, you who value ambition over blood and loyalty, you have no place here." He did not shout. He did not need to. His quiet words were a death sentence. "You are stripped of your title, your lands, and your name. You are exiled. Leave my territory by sunrise, or my wolves will hunt you down, as the rogue you are." Vorlog's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Defeated, shamed, and utterly broken, he turned and stumbled away, swallowed by the darkness, his political life over. A ripple of fear and awe went through the assembled packs. They had just witnessed the forging of a new age. Thalen's attention then fell upon Kalen. The Shadowmane Alpha, now back in his human form, knelt on the forest floor, his head bowed, blood matting his dark hair. "You challenged my blood," Thalen said, his voice hard. "You hunted my mate." "I was wrong," Kalen bit out, the words tasting like poison. "Your claim is true. The Omega, she is under your protection. I yield." It was a total, unconditional surrender. Thalen gave a curt nod. "Then rise, Kalen of the Shadowmanes, and remember this night. Remember who holds the true power here." With the challenges met and the new order established, Thalen's rigid, kingly posture softened almost imperceptibly. His gaze found the gathering stone. Olin was still there, now held in the safe, sturdy arms of Lord Marin. The boy's wide, silver eyes were fixed on Lyris, a look of pure, unadulterated hope dawning on his small face. Thalen led Lyris toward the stone. The sea of wolves parted before them, their deference absolute. He stopped before his son, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, weary thing, but it transformed his scarred face. "Olin," he said, his voice now gentle, "go to her." Marin lowered the boy to the ground. For a second, Olin hesitated, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Then his face broke into a radiant, tearful smile. "Mother," he cried, the word now a celebration, a song. He ran. He launched himself into Lyris's arms as she fell to her knees to receive him. Her arms wrapped around his small, warm body, and she held him as if she would never let go. She buried her face in his silver hair, inhaling his sweet, milky scent, now so perfectly harmonized with her own. Sobs of pure, cathartic joy shook her body. 4 years of silent agony, of aching emptiness, washed away in the torrent of her tears. He was real. He was hers. He was safe. "I knew you would come," he whispered into her neck, his small arms clinging to her tightly. "Papa said you were a ghost, but I knew you were real." She pulled back, her hands framing his face, her thumbs wiping away his tears. "I am real, my sweet boy. I am here. I will never leave you again." Thalen watched them, his expression one of profound, quiet emotion. He had built walls of iron and ice around his heart to protect his throne, and this small Omega and her silver-eyed son had just torn them down to the last stone. He knelt beside them, placing a large, warm hand on Olin's back, the other resting on Lyris's shoulder. For the first time, they were a family, whole and unbroken, under the light of the moon. The journey back to the keep was a dream. Thalen rode his great destrier, with Lyris seated before him, holding a sleeping Olin in her arms. No one spoke. The silence was not empty, but filled with the quiet comfort of a world set right. He did not take them to the royal nursery, or some newly appointed suite. He took them to his own chambers, the solar where he had stood alone just nights before. He laid their sleeping son in his own massive bed, pulling the thick furs up to his chin. Olin's small hand still clutched the wooden wolf. Then Thalen turned to her. He stood before the hearth, the fire now roaring, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. He reached out and gently touched a long scratch on her cheek, a souvenir from her flight through the woods. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. "I was wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble. "To hide you, to lock you away. I thought I was protecting him, but I was only repeating the mistakes of my own solitary life. A king needs his kingdom. A father needs his family." "You did what you thought was right," she whispered, her hand rising to cover his. "Just as I did." His silver eyes searched hers, filled with 1,000 unspoken things. The loneliness, the weight of the crown, the fear he had felt when he thought he might lose them both. "My wolf," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "has been silent for a very long time, Lyris. A king cannot afford to let the beast rule. But tonight, when I saw them hunting you, it did not ask for permission." He paused, his thumb stroking her skin. "It has been quiet for a decade. It has only ever roared for you. Her own wolf, now fully awake and singing in her veins, recognized the truth in his words. It was not just a bond of blood through their son. It was something more, something older, a bond of two solitary souls who had found their other half in the most impossible of circumstances. She leaned in and, on impulse, pressed her lips to the most prominent scar on his cheek, a silent acceptance of the warrior, the king, and the man. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his powerful frame. When he opened them again, the last of the ice was gone, replaced by a deep, burning warmth that was meant only for her. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound homecoming. It was the closing of a circle, a promise of 1,000 sunrises yet to come. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon in shades of rose and silver, Lyra stood at the window of the solar, Thalin's strong arm wrapped around her waist. Olin slept peacefully in the great bed behind them, safe and loved. Below, the kingdom was waking to a new day, under a new kind of rule, one forged not just in power, but in sacrifice and love. The weight of the crown was still there, but now it did not rest on one man's shoulders alone. It was a burden they would carry together. The king, his queen, and the heir who had bound them stood together in the quiet light, their reign just beginning. In the kingdom of the great wolf, the silver-eyed dawn had finally come.